Okay, now the role of women throughout the world has significant demographic effects on whether populations are growing or declining, and that is what this video is all about. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So before we get into how women's roles affect demographics, let's start with defining our terms. When we talk about women's status, we're referring to the level of equality between men and women that exists in a particular society, and there are two basic categories here. First, some societies hold traditional gender roles, which means that women's social status is lower than men, and women are mainly seen as the bearers of children and the one who makes everybody else's sandwiches. But other societies hold more egalitarian gender roles, which means that women's status is equal to men. Alright, so what does any of that have to do with population and demographics? Well, it's a well-studied phenomenon that in places dominated by traditional gender roles, women tend to have more babies. But in places that hold more egalitarian ideas, the elevation of women's status leads to a decrease in fertility rates. And there are essentially three ways that women's status can be elevated, and when these are present, the fertility rate will almost always be affected. First is access to education. Pretty universally, when women have more access to education, they tend to have fewer children, which is known as the more books, less babies phenomenon. And why is that? Well, educated women tend to view cultural norms about how many babies they should have more skeptically. Like in societies with traditional gender roles, the number of babies a woman has is kind of like the measuring stick of how good of a woman she is. It's like, here's a woman with 12 babies, and that is a woman. But here's one with 2, and what are you even doing with your life? So the more education a woman has, the more likely she is to question those norms and make informed decisions about how many children she wants to have versus how many children she is expected to have. And second, women's status can be elevated through increased access to family planning, and those tools include contraception and birth control pills or intrauterine devices that prevent pregnancy. Or it can include medical procedures like abortion, which end unwanted pregnancies. And I know even saying that word is controversial, but look, I'm just telling you that it exists and that it has demographic consequences, which in this case means a lower fertility rate. Okay, and then third, women's status can be elevated by increased access to employment. Generally, in traditional societies, the domain of women is in the home, and so in that environment, fertility rates tend to increase. But as more opportunities for women in the workplace have opened in egalitarian societies over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, many women choose to delay marriage and childbearing in order to focus more on their careers. And what effect does that have on population? Well, if you said it decreases the fertility rate, then you are absolutely correct. But the changing role of women also has an effect on mortality and migration, and let's consider each in turn. First, the elevation of women affects infant mortality rates, which, in case you forgot, is the measure of how many infants die within the first year of life per 1,000 births. And remember that a country's infant mortality rate is often correlated with their access to healthcare and education. So as women have more access to education and healthcare and family planning, they tend to have fewer babies, but the babies they do have are more likely to live. In other words, as women are elevated, the infant mortality rate decreases and maternal mortality rates drop as well. And then second, the role of women affects migration rates. And here's where I introduce you to our boy Georg Ravenstein, who was a 19th century geographer who developed 11 laws of migration. And he developed these laws to try to explain why and under what conditions people choose to migrate. And I'm not going to nerd out and explain all 11 laws to you, as fun as that would be for all of us. But for our purposes here, you just need to know Law 6, which says that women are more likely to migrate within their home country, while men are more likely to migrate to other countries. And that observation is consistent with many of the inter-country migrations we still witness today. In countries where women have more autonomy, which is to say women's status is elevated, they tend to be the chief movers when it comes to migration, and mostly it's rural to urban migration. For example, in the last 40 years, millions of women in China migrated from the countryside to urban areas to take jobs in factories in the service sector. And in general, urban areas are far more progressive towards women's roles than rural areas, and so when women migrate to the cities, they often find themselves elevated in terms of their societal role. Well, okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 2, and click here to grab my video note guides for this video and all my videos, which are going to help you follow along and get all this information firmly crammed into your brain folds. And I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.